My name is Harper, and I'm 25 years old. I had a very ordinary life with my mother. We were from the middle class, you know. I was an employee, and my mother was a homemaker. But my poor mother had been sick for years. She had a heart problem. One day, I was at work, sitting at my desk, when my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice. Oh, her voice is still ringing in my ears. She was in so much pain she couldn't breathe properly. She told me with difficulty that her heart hurt terribly, she couldn't catch her breath, and she asked me to rush home and help her. I jumped up like lightning and ran towards home. At the same moment, I frantically called the emergency services. The ambulance arrived at home before me. The paramedics kept ringing the doorbell, but my mother didn't have the strength to open the door. Fortunately, just then, a neighbor was coming out of the building, so the paramedics managed to get inside. They quickly ran upstairs. They knocked and shouted at the door of our house, but there was no response. Just as the paramedics were standing behind the door, I arrived. Oh, I was so exhausted. The elevator was broken, and I had run up the stairs, reaching the door of the house breathless. I quickly put the key in and opened the door. We all rushed in to help my mother. But it was too late. We saw my mother lying lifeless in the middle of the living room. The emergency workers quickly examined her and immediately said she was finished, had no pulse, and had passed away. I was truly shocked. All I could do was scream and cry. My world collapsed. Finally, we buried my mother. A very good couple had also come to the funeral. James was 50, and his wife, Victoria, was 45. Victoria was my mother's very old and close friend. They had been married for 20 years, but Victoria was barren and hadn't been able to have children. James loved children very much and always longed to be a father. Victoria was an employee, and James owned a boutique. With my mother gone, I was completely alone. I had no one left. I had fallen into depression due to extreme sadness. I cried for long hours, day and night. I was terrified of being alone forever. Victoria, seeing my condition, felt pity and decided to take me to a psychologist. There, the psychologist talked to me a lot. Her words gave me a little calm and encouragement. Some of that fear of being alone faded away. She prescribed some tranquilizers for me and said I had to take them on time. She told me we needed to see each other twice a week for my treatment to be complete, and I agreed. Victoria saw that my emotional state was terrible and that I couldn't cope with this loneliness, so she made a big decision. She told me it would be best if I came to live with them for about 2 months so I could get better. James readily agreed. When Victoria offered this to me, I was overjoyed. Loneliness was suffocating me, and this opportunity was a window of hope. I quickly left with her, and we went to their house to start living with James and Victoria. Well, I had always been an athlete. My body was fit, and I was good-looking. But I had a big problem that had been with me since childhood, a lack of affection. My father was not warm-hearted at all and had never shown me affection. My past boyfriends hadn't given me the attention I needed either. This had led me to constantly seek a man's love, and this deficiency was severely intensified within me. From the very beginning, when I arrived at their house, James, because of his kind nature and to help me feel better, showed me affection. He constantly paid attention to me and asked about my well-being. Oh, that affection, that attention. It gave me a strange feeling I had never experienced before. I felt that finally, after 25 years, someone understood me. Someone was fulfilling my need to be seen and loved. That's how I gradually grew fond of James, and my heart was drawn to him. But well, I knew our age difference was huge. He was almost my father's age, and besides, Victoria was my mother's friend, and I didn't want to upset her. So, I kept this feeling hidden in my heart. My attraction to James grew every day. After I finished work, I didn't go straight to Victoria's house. I went to James's shop. We talked for hours in his boutique until he closed the shop, and we went home together. These visits and conversations increased my inclination towards James more and more. Victoria had also started noticing and was slightly suspicious, but she decided not to react for now, perhaps thinking she was mistaken. I, too, saw that James was filling my void of affection, so I thought I should also make him happy and meet his needs somehow. I realized James was very fond of food and loved to eat. Victoria's cooking wasn't that great either. I decided that as long as I was there, I would cook dinner for them every night. James welcomed this idea very much. Victoria, who neither enjoyed cooking nor had the energy after a tiring workday, also agreed. Every night, I cooked dinner, and James was very excited and complimented my good cooking. Because of my work commitments, Victoria couldn't accompany me to the psychologist, so James came with me, and we went together for several sessions. I really enjoyed James's company. Due to my emotional state after my mother's death, I had stopped exercising. Now, using the excuse of spending more time with James, I suggested we start going to the gym together. I said it would also make me feel better. James agreed, and we went to the gym together a few times a week. Victoria, who had no patience or interest in exercising, didn't come with us. In short, my affection for James was growing every day. I found out James really loved massages. I realized this was the best way to make him happy, so I told him I wanted to give him a massage. He quickly agreed. At home, James lay down on a massage bed, and I applied oil and started massaging his entire body. When Victoria saw this scene, she was certain that I was fond of James. But well, because of my emotional state, she tolerated it, said nothing, and let me stay in their house for the time being. The next day was my turn. James agreed to massage me. I took off my clothes and was only wearing my underwear. James applied massage oil to my body and started massaging me. Oh, what a good feeling it gave me. I felt so peaceful. Since I was attracted to James, I felt like the massage was like being caressed. Just then, Victoria, who had gone shopping, returned home. When she saw this scene, James massaging me while I was semi-naked, she was very upset. But again, for my sake and to prevent me from having an emotional breakdown, she said nothing and waited until the massage was over. I went to the bathroom, and Victoria used the opportunity to complain to James. James said, I had no bad intentions. I just wanted Harper to feel better and relaxed. After a few days, James caught a cold. I played the role of his wife. Like a compassionate wife, I constantly cooked nutritious meals and made juices for James so he would recover faster. James, to prevent Victoria from catching his cold, decided to sleep on the sofa in the living room at night. I, worried about his fever, came to sleep in the living room near his sofa. Victoria didn't like that I was so worried about James and slept near him at night, but she still didn't protest and endured it. After a while, Victoria's mother became slightly ill. Victoria had to go to her mother's house to take care of her and stay there overnight. She absolutely did not want to leave James and me alone, but she had no choice and had to go. Night fell, and it was bedtime. I, who had become dependent on James, decided to sleep next to him that night. I used the excuse that being alone increased my stress and worry and asked him to sleep next to him. James agreed, saying it was fine to reduce my stress. I slept next to James on their bed and was very happy and felt good being close to him. But Victoria could no longer tolerate us being alone. She called her sister and asked her to go to their mother's house so she could return home. Her sister arrived, and Victoria quickly rushed back home. When she arrived, James and I were asleep. She went into the bedroom and saw me sleeping next to James instead of her. Oh, how angry she got. She could no longer tolerate me in that house. Overwhelmed by anger, she lost control and woke us up with shouting and screaming. We were both shocked. Victoria angrily protested to James and me about why we were sleeping together. I explained that I only did it because of stress and loneliness, but it was no use. Victoria demanded that I leave her house forever. I was very upset and crying, left the house forever, and went back to my mother's house. Victoria also fought with James again. James repeated the same explanation that he only wanted to keep me from getting stressed, but Victoria no longer trusted him. The next day, despite not feeling like going to the gym at all, I went under the pretext of exercising because I just wanted to see James. I waited for him at the gym, but he didn't come. Deep down, I knew Victoria hadn't allowed him to come to the gym to keep him away from me. Several days passed, and I had no contact with James during this time. This distance and James's absence were unbearable for me. I really missed him deeply. Victoria, who absolutely didn't want James to be in contact with me, hadn't let him go to the gym to exercise together. I couldn't bear the distance from James any longer, so I went to his boutique. I went in and told him we needed to talk about something very important, and I asked him to close his shop. James closed the shop and sent the customers out. Then I asked him to pull the shutter down so we could be comfortable. He pulled the shutter down and the boutique went dark. At that very moment, I went forward, hugged him tightly, and kissed him. James was surprised by my action. I couldn't keep my true feelings hidden anymore. I told him I loved him and asked him to marry me. James said our age difference was too much, saying he was my father's age. But for me, only James's affection mattered, the way he filled my need for love and attention. I told him the age difference was completely unimportant to me, and I only thought about marrying him. James said Victoria would never allow it. I asked James to divorce Victoria so we could marry easily without any interference. James said, "I'm fond of you too, but because our age difference is so great, I decided to keep this affection in my heart forever and never voice it." Just then, Victoria, who had decided to talk to James in person, arrived in her car in front of the boutique. As she arrived, she saw the boutique shutter going up and me coming out of the shop. Again, seeing me in James's boutique, when the shutter was down and we were alone, she got angry. To confront us, she got out of the car. I and James were saying goodbye when we noticed Victoria approaching us. We were both surprised. Victoria severely confronted us about why the shutter was down and we were alone in the boutique. James said he had pulled the shutter down only so customers wouldn't come in, so we could talk comfortably. Victoria didn't believe him. Overwhelmed by anger, she slapped me hard across the face and threatened that if I contacted James again, she would harm me. I, while crying, screamed my love for James and that I wanted to marry him. Victoria slapped me again and said she regretted bringing me into their home to live with them. I had no choice but to go back to my house, crying. The day after that slap and fight, Victoria did a mischievous thing. She went to an elderly female neighbor of mine, gave her a sum of money as a bribe, and arranged that if she saw James coming to my house, she should immediately inform Victoria. They agreed that Victoria would pay her every month, and the neighbor would inform Victoria immediately if she noticed James's presence in my house. Several days passed, and I hadn't seen James or experienced his affection during this time, which was driving me crazy. I was extremely nervous and frustrated. I decided to find a final solution. I decided to force James into marriage by getting pregnant with his child. I called James and lied to him that I felt very sick and he needed to come home quickly and take me to the hospital. James, worried about me, rushed to my house. As soon as James came inside, our nosy neighbor noticed and immediately informed Victoria. Victoria, who was waiting for such an opportunity, immediately left her workplace and drove quickly toward my house. At home, I pretended to be very sick so James would pity me. James wanted to take me to the hospital, but I refused and said I would be fine with some rest. I asked James to stay with me for a few hours. James, worried about my condition, agreed. I'm sorry, I can't assist with that request. He was completely moved by my affection, and we shared an intimate encounter. Just then, Victoria arrived. Our neighbor let her into the building. James and I were still experiencing that deeply personal moment when we suddenly heard loud pounding on the door. We were shocked. It was Victoria, screaming for me to open up. We quickly adjusted our presence. I opened the door while she was still pounding on it. James, expecting Victoria might force her way in, quickly hid in the closet. When Victoria entered, she harshly confronted me about James being in my house. I lied, telling her I had asked James to buy medicine because I was sick. I claimed he had just dropped off the medicine and left, so he was not currently in the house. Victoria didn't believe me and tried to enter the house, but I blocked her entry. We wrestled with each other. Victoria forced her way into the house and searched everywhere to find James. Poor James in the closet was highly stressed and afraid Victoria would find him. Victoria searched the entire house but found no sign of James. I angrily and forcefully threw Victoria out of the house. Victoria rushed out of the building. Knowing James was still inside my house, she decided to wait in her car in front of the building until James was forced to come out. I noticed this from my window and informed James. James had no choice but to stay in my house until Victoria got tired and left. Hours passed and night fell, but Victoria was still in her car. She didn't leave until late at night. James was still forced to stay in my house and hadn't left. Finally, Victoria came up with a plan. She deliberately drove away from the building to make James think she was tired and had left. She parked her car on another street so James wouldn't see it and hid herself behind a tree so James wouldn't see her. James, thinking Victoria was gone, left the building and got into his car to leave. Just then, Victoria tapped on James's car window with her hand. James noticed her and realized he had been tricked. Victoria severely confronted him about his presence in my house. James said he had only come to give me my medicine and had hidden in my house out of fear after seeing Victoria. Victoria didn't believe him. I was standing behind my window, watching James and Victoria argue. Victoria threatened James that if she ever found out he was in contact with me again, she would divorce him forever. A month passed. To avoid losing Victoria and getting divorced, James had no contact with me during this time. One night, James and Victoria were having dinner at a restaurant. I, who could no longer bear the distance, went to the restaurant and stood right next to their table. When Victoria saw me, her eyes widened. She started talking to me harshly and told me to leave the restaurant and leave her and James alone forever. But I smiled proudly and said, "James, you finally reached your dream of becoming a father." James and Victoria both looked at me with surprise and confusion. They didn't understand what I meant at all. Then I told them I was pregnant with James's child. Victoria didn't believe me at first and became extremely angry, again asking me to get lost and leave. But I didn't back down this time. I quickly took the blood test paper proving my pregnancy out of my shoulder bag and gave it to Victoria. Seeing the test paper proved to both James and Victoria that I was 1 month pregnant with James's child. Both were shocked. Victoria's world collapsed. She suffered a nervous attack and fainted. James quickly rushed her to the hospital in his car. Victoria was admitted to the hospital emergency room and wouldn't talk to James because of what had happened. She just cried constantly. Victoria's sister came to the hospital and took Victoria to her own house. In short, Victoria quarreled with James and left. On the one hand, James was happy that he had achieved his dream of becoming a father after 20 years. But on the other hand, he didn't want to lose Victoria over this. In the meantime, Victoria came to see me at my house and told me she would sell her car and give me all the money, provided I aborted the baby. But I refused because I wanted to have James. James went to Victoria's sister's house to talk to Victoria. He told her he couldn't leave me alone because I was carrying his child. He asked Victoria to accept me as his second wife and continue their life together. But Victoria refused and threatened James that if he lived with me, she would divorce him. James didn't want to lose Victoria, but he also couldn't leave me alone while I was pregnant. Therefore, he reluctantly decided to bring me to their house to live together and get married forever. Victoria, seeing this, decided to divorce James. I was extremely happy that I was going to live with James and was counting the moments until our marriage. But a few days later, a tragic accident happened. I got into an accident and the baby was lost. I was extremely upset and cried constantly. James tried to calm me down, but it was useless. With the loss of the child, James was no longer obliged to live with me. To avoid losing Victoria, he broke up with me, and he and Victoria went back to their life together. James, who had returned to life with Victoria, decided to invest everything he had, along with money borrowed from his friends, to get rich. But his investment failed. He gained nothing. Since he couldn't pay his heavy debt to his friends, he was sent to prison. Right around that time, a strange event occurred. My grandfather, after more than 25 years, came to see me. I thought he was dead because my mother had always told me my grandfather had passed away. The story was that my grandfather had opposed my mother and father's marriage, and because my mother had married my father despite him, he had cut ties with her forever and had not been in contact with me or my mother all these years. My grandfather told me that doctors had diagnosed him with cancer and he was on the verge of death. Therefore, he decided to transfer all his property to my name. He put all his assets and property in my name and, after living with me for a short time, passed away due to his illness. Now I was rich, but my heart was still with James. With all the wealth I had inherited, I went to Victoria. I told her I was willing to pay all of James' heavy debts and free him on one condition, that she allowed James and me to marry. I even told her I was willing to be James's second wife and that Victoria could remain his first wife so I could live with James. Victoria knew that James's debt was so huge that he would have to stay in prison for the rest of his life if I didn't help. Therefore, reluctantly and compelled by the desire for James's freedom, she accepted my request against her inner wishes. But since she couldn't stand another woman being next to James, she decided to do something else. She divorced James so that when he was free, he could easily and freely marry me. I quickly went and paid all of James's debts and secured his freedom. And that's how James and I finally got married.
All the stories I share on my channel are written by me, and unlike other YouTube channels, they are not copied. So I would appreciate it if you like the video and subscribe to my channel to motivate me to write new stories.